From the Pope, the Council, and the Mass, Answers to Questions the Traditionalists Have Asked by James Likoudis and Kenneth D. Whitehead, 2nd edition. Question 14. Didn't Cardinal Ottaviani, former head of the Holy Office, intervene to criticize severely the manner in which the Novus Ordo downplayed the idea of sacrifice? In 1969, when a small group of French and Italian theologians wrote a 29-page critical study of the Novus Ordo Missae, the late Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani was joined by his colleague Cardinal Antonio Bacci in writing a letter to Pope Paul VI enunciating their opinion that, quote, the Novus Ordo Missae, considering the new elements susceptible of widely differing evaluations, which appear to be implied or taken for granted, represents as a whole and in detail a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Holy Mass as it was formulated in Session 22 of the Council of Trent. Therefore, we most earnestly beseech your Holiness not to deprive us, at a time of such painful divisions and ever-increasing perils for the purity of the faith and the unity of the Church, of the possibility of continuing to have recourse to the fruitful integrity of that Missale Romanum of St. Pius V, so highly praised by your Holiness and so deeply venerated and loved by the whole Catholic Church. Unquote. This was the principal point of the so-called Ottaviani Intervention. However, it is also true that a letter dated February 17, 1970, was subsequently published in which the same Cardinal Ottaviani declared to the author of a work dealing with the Novus Ordo as follows, quote, I have rejoiced profoundly to read the discourse by the Holy Father on the question of the new Ordo Missae, and especially the doctrinal precisions contained in his discourses at the public audiences of November 19th and 26th, see texts of both of these discourses in Appendix 2, after which I believe no one can any longer be genuinely scandalized. As for the rest, a prudent and intelligent catechesis must be undertaken to solve some legitimate perplexities which the text is capable of arousing. In this sense, I wish your doctrinal note on the Novus Ordo and the activity of the Militia Sanctae Mariae wide diffusion and success. Unquote. This second letter, although it has been a matter of public record since 1970, has not been publicized to the extent that the original quote-unquote Ottaviani Intervention was publicized. Many Catholics are unaware of the existence of this second letter, in which the respected Curia Cardinal declared that, quote, no one can any longer be genuinely scandalized, unquote. Though a few writers, aware of the second letter, have alleged that the blind cardinal was the victim of a fraud in obtaining his signature to it, Cardinal Ottaviani never in any way repudiated the sentiments expressed in this letter, never did he go on record to disavow it, although he could have easily done so. Footnote. A highly respected and reliable Catholic publisher revealed to Catholics United for the Faith that Cardinal Ottaviani expressed to him his distress and anger that these allegations had been circulated by the French publisher Jean Madiran of Itinéraire. End of footnote. In fact, later on, Cardinal Ottaviani published still another statement in which he said, quote, the beauty of the Church is equally resplendent in the variety of the liturgical rites which enrich her divine cult when they are legitimate and conform to the faith. Precisely the legitimacy of their origin protects and guards them against the infiltration of errors. The purity and unity of the faith is in this manner also upheld by the supreme magisterium of the Pope through the liturgical laws. Unquote. Here Cardinal Ottaviani gives the most powerful and conclusive argument that the new order of the Mass cannot really contain or tend toward heresy, because its doctrine is guaranteed by the divinely assisted magisterium of the Catholic Church. Those who attempt to justify their rejection of the Novus Ordo on the basis of Cardinal Ottaviani's initial opinion of it, delivered before its definitive version was even available, conveniently ignore these otherwise words of the same humble servant of the Holy See, words delivered in October 1963 at the second session of the Second Vatican Council. Cardinal Ottaviani said on that occasion, quote, the words of Christ, feed my sheep, are words which have been addressed only to his vicar, and it follows that whoever would wish to be counted among the flock of Christ must submit to the universal pastor appointed by Christ. No one can be an exception to this rule, not even bishops. Unquote. Though the promulgation of the New Roman Missal by Pope Paul VI was not a dogmatic definition, the virtually universal acceptance of the new Missal by the bishops of the entire Catholic world is further proof that there is nothing heretical or contrary to Catholic tradition which would prevent its acceptance by Roman Rite Catholics, unless virtually the entire Church is now irremediably in error, something Christ promised would never happen. Footnote. In the nature of the case, the promulgation of Paul VI's new Missal was a disciplinary act, as was the promulgation of St. Pius V's Missal in 1570, not an exercise of the Pope's teaching authority. End of footnote. Since Cardinal Ottaviani said the Tridentine Mass over a lifetime of outstanding service to the Church, it is easy to understand his feeling that the Church should not be, quote-unquote, deprived of the Mass, which had become so familiar. Many priests and bishops felt this way. However, this Prince of the Church also accepted, and as quoted above, indeed rejoiced, in the explanations offered by the supreme authority in the Church in response to his earlier doubts and questionings. In this, as in his entire priestly life, Cardinal Ottaviani could well serve as a model for all of us. The testimonies of other eminent servants of the Church can be added here. For example, the late Cardinal Charles Journet, one of the most erudite Thomistic theologians of his time and the author of what is perhaps among the greatest works on the Church, delivered these touching remarks about his feelings on the day before he ceased to celebrate the Tridentine Mass which he so loved, November 29th, 1969. Quote, "The Holy Father has very pointedly asked for obedience when the new Ordo Missae begins to be celebrated in the different dioceses of Switzerland. Tomorrow morning, for the first time, I will say the new Ordo Missae with profound obedience, pleased to have something to give to God. It will not be a little thing. For many years I have celebrated the old Ordo, which I know almost by heart. Each time that I celebrate it, I discover new things. It is as dear to me as my own flesh and blood. I must now leave it. I am pleased to give something to God. Let me take care to say, there is no renouncing of anything essential. I will return to this point in a moment. One renounces nothing essential pertaining to what is of divine law. The substance of the Mass remains absolutely the same. There is the offertory, the consecration, ... And the Sovereign Pontiff has recalled expressly what was not expressed sufficiently in the rubrics of the new Ordo, that the Mass is a sacrifice. He has recalled that there is a change of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. All these things, which are not Protestant, are truly Catholic and also Orthodox. Thus there is the reaffirmation of the classic Catholic doctrine on the Eucharistic sacrifice, ... Certainly in all this there is our acute sense of uprootedness. Must one accept it or not? Ah, yes, when one tears something dear away from us, and when this is demanded of us in the name of obedience, for a future which is hidden from us, one must say yes. One must be content in saying yes. One must be content even to feel suffering. But it is with happiness that one suffers, for he has something to give to God. Thus let us not get into a frenzy. There is no necessity for any uproar concerning the Mass." Unquote. In a letter dated January 13th, 1975, the distinguished cardinal also spoke his mind concerning Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre's seminary at Écône. This letter was addressed to a religious sister who had inquired about his views. Quote, "I have your letter. I have been very moved by what you write me. In the face of one drift towards the modernist heresy, there has been created another drift towards an integriste, traditionalist schism." Unquote. It is interesting that Cardinal Journet distinguishes the modernist heresy from the traditionalist schism. It is surely true that the traditionalists began by denying no Catholic doctrine. Indeed, they began by attempting to defend doctrines which they saw endangered. Soon, however, to defend their own position, they had to deny, at least as a practical matter, the doctrine that the Pope is the operating head of the Church on earth, in disciplinary matters as well as in his teaching office. The evolution of the traditionalist position fits the pattern that St. Augustine once described, namely that a heresy is a schism grown old. One may start with schism, and in defending it, fall into heresy. Cardinal Journet describes the process in the rest of the letter he sent to the religious sister who had inquired about his views. There is a new, there is a new Port Royal which is lacerating France, and not only France but the Church, and it is a much more grave threat than the first, since in order to defend itself from being schismatic, it is obliged to see heresies in the decisions of the Pope and of an ecumenical council. It is necessary to convince your fellow sisters that they are engaged on a path which will separate them more and more from the Church, for the Church of all time, l'Église de toujours, is the Church which has a Pope, unquote. See footnote. A celebrated Benedictine abbey, that's the Port Royal, which profoundly influenced the religious and literary life of France during the 17th century. In 1636, the Abbé de Saint-Cyran became the spiritual director of the monastery, which he soon made a hotbed of Jansenism. End of footnote. This last is a point on which Cardinal Journet, Cardinal Ottaviani, and all Catholics ought to be able to agree, namely that the Catholic Church, quote-unquote, is the Church which has a Pope. Addendum to question 14. The book, The Ottaviani Intervention, a short critical study of the New Order of the Mass, originally written in 1969 and reissued by Tan Books and Publishers in 1992 in a quote-unquote fresh translation, and with an introduction by Father Anthony Cicada, has been widely distributed by various groups of traditionalists eager to discredit the new Mass, unquote. Quote-unquote, new Mass. As Father Cicada notes, the book's, quote, central contention is that the new order of the Mass teems with dangerous errors in doctrine and represents an attack against the Catholic teaching on the Mass, unquote. The Ottaviani Intervention was actually written in large part by Father Gerard de Laurier, O.P., who in 1983 was illicitly consecrated a bishop by the erratic Archbishop Peter Martin Negodintuk of Hanoi, I think it is. Okay, both men suffering excommunications by the Holy See as a result. It is to be remarked that the original letter to Pope Paul VI by Cardinals Alfredo Ottaviani and Antonio Bacci, as reproduced in the Ottaviani Intervention and expressing their concerns regarding the new rite of the Mass, was written on September 25, 1969. In his address of November 19, 1969, Pope Paul VI took special care to reassure the faithful who had been disturbed by criticisms that, quote, nothing has been changed of the substance of our traditional Mass, unquote. Pope Paul VI also replied firmly to those who feared that the law of prayer and the law of faith had been compromised, declaring, quote, it is not so, absolutely not, unquote. Then in March 1970, the first Latin edition of the Roman Missal appeared with a doctrinal exposition on the Mass that was clearly intended to affirm traditional doctrine on the Mass as sacrifice and sacrament. In the introduction to his book, however, Father Anthony Cicada attempted to show that the statements of Cardinal Ottaviani quoted above that affirm his adherence to the new rite of the Mass are inauthentic. Motivated by suspicion, he provides no solid evidence that the cardinal's statements were subject to any kind of fraud or forgery. Certainly in the years before his death in 1979, Cardinal Ottaviani was so solicitous for doctrinal orthodoxy that he never uttered a single word that would convey any repudiation of the Mass of Paul VI, nor did Cardinal Bacci. The quality of Father Cicada's allegations may be judged by his advocacy of so-called sedevacantism, i.e., he believes that since Pope John Paul II is a heretic, the See of Peter is vacant. There is no longer any pope at the head of the Church. On August 6, 1979, Pope John Paul II delivered the following words at the solemn funeral mass of Cardinal Ottaviani, quote, he was really a great priest, distinguished for his religious piety, exemplary fidelity in the service of Holy Church and of the Apostolic See, solicitous in his ministry and in the practice of Christian charity. He possessed that spirit which is expressed in special attachment to Peter and the faith of Peter, and again in keen sensitiveness to what the Church of Peter is and does and must do. Fidelity was the constant characteristic of his whole life. His was really a tried and unflagging fidelity, always available, always ready to serve the Church. He also saw in reforms the providential sign of the times, so that he was able and wished to collaborate with my predecessors John XXIII and Paul VI, as he had already done with Pius XII, and even earlier with Pius XI. His existence was literally spent for the good of the Holy Church of God. Unquote.